Library Center. My name is Jean Hartensott. I'm the programming librarian here. Today, as we continue to celebrate African American Heritage Month, we are very happy to present this lecture to you on the Bronx African American experience. Please join me in welcoming Anthony Greene, the Educational Coordinator of the Bronx Historical Society, who will be presenting this talk.
Thank you, Jean, for that introduction, and welcome. My name is Anthony Greene, and as Jean said, I am the Education Coordinator of the Bronx County Historical Society. In addition to today's program, the Society does a number of things, including administering 2 historic house museums, the Edgar Allan Poe House, which is not too far from where we are currently located right now, right in Poe Park, and the Valentine Variant House Museum of Bronx History. The Society also runs a full research library and the Bronx County Archives. Our archivist happens to be here, Dr. Peter Derrick. Our essence, though, is to provide the public with quality programming, like the exhibit that we've displayed outside, and the lecture you will experience today. If at any point during the lecture you have a question, just raise your hand. I'll do my best to answer the questions, and I'll also make sure that I get through all the information. If it gets to be too much, we can hold it off to the end. But I want to get my information out, show you some of the slides I've prepared, but also make sure you have your questions answered. It's an honor to speak to you today. As a historian, one finds himself most at peace when they're able to do research and present information about a topic that they hold close to their heart and soul. I've given numerous lectures on different topics here and other places around the Bronx, and each topic has a special place for me. But this topic, the Bronx African American experience, is really part of my soul. In continuing the tradition of recognizing Black history started by Dr. Carter G. Woodson in 1926, I would be remiss not to acknowledge the uniqueness of Black History Month. We take this time to formally highlight the contributions of Black people to our country, often uncovering names forgotten or omitted from our traditional history books. While this is a great thing, we need to remember that Black history is intertwined with American history. And as Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois stated, you cannot have American history without Black people. What's amazing about this month is that it started at a time when America was dealing with this racial ghost. Dr. Carter G. Woodson, pictured here, started what was then called Negro History Week. In 1976, it was expanded to a month-long celebration. Dr. Du Bois is a hero of not only myself, but a number of other scholars and people that aren't just Blacks, whites, people of all backgrounds can really draw strength from Dr. Du Bois and his accomplishments. And in his landmark book, The Souls of Black Folk, which was probably his skinniest volume, he wrote over 50 books, and a lot of them were 300, 400, 500 pages. In about 150 pages, the prose of that book really do justice to what Dr. Du Bois' perspective of Black people was. And when he wrote the book, right around the turn of the century, it was really a landmark accomplishment, especially the things that he was stating about Blacks. And this is a quote, and you can pull hundreds of quotes from this book, but this is a quote that really struck home with me. The history of the American Negro is the history of this strife, this ongoing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. In this merging, he wishes neither of the older selves to be lost. He would not Africanize America, for America has too much to teach the world in Africa. He would not bleach his Negro soul in a flood of white Americanism, for he knows that Negro blood has a message for the world. He simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American, without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, without having doors of opportunity closed roughly in his face. And this quote, rings true throughout all aspects of life, but especially in the upcoming presidential election, when we'll really see some racial issues come to the surface. Just to clarify a few points, when I refer to the Bronx, I'm going to refer to the geographic or the political entity that was created in 1898 when New York City incorporated into the 5 boroughs. The Bronx, prior to that, was a part of Westchester County. And in 1874, the western portion of the Bronx was annexed by the city of New York. 1895, the eastern portion, with its current boundaries, was annexed. But just for simplicity today, when I refer to the Bronx, I'm referring to the current political borders. Also, the term black. Today it has a much different meaning than it did 300 years ago. But for simplicity, today I'm going to refer to the term black and make that for any person who is of African ancestry. The colony of New Amsterdam was established in 1625 as a Dutch trading outpost. The British established the first permanent settlement in Jamestown in 1607, bringing the first Africans as indentured servants in 1619. While we consider this the beginning of black history here in the hemisphere, the Spanish and Portuguese were trading with Africans as early as the 1440s and used blacks in their missions of conquest and colonization throughout the Americas. In fact, many of the Iberians were familiar with blacks because the Moors who invaded North Africa and conquered the peninsula in the 8th century were eventually expelled in 1492, but forged a bond with the Iberians. The footprints of those North African civilizations were noted not only in the architecture of Spain and Portugal, but also in the language, the religious clashes, and the cultural diaspora that developed. Okay, so we're looking now at one of the oldest maps of the Bronx and of the New York City area. And this is a map that I like to use in a lot of my talks because it gives us a sense of where Jonas Bronx was, where the Bronx was in relation to the mainland, in relation to the island of Manhattan, but also the advanced cartography that was available back then, because we see that this map is pretty accurate. This area right here is the southern tip of the Bronx, near the Hell's Gate. This is where Jonas Bronx in 1639 established the first European settlement here on the mainland. And you can see this is Manhattan Island here, and at the bottom of the island is where the Dutch established the colony of the city of New Amsterdam. The colony was called New Netherlands. Jonas Bronx was followed by Anne Hutchinson in 1643, which is actually the year that Bronx died. Hutchinson was killed by Native Americans soon after. Later on, in 1654, the town of Westchester was established, not too far north of that area. The first blacks who were brought to New Amsterdam were actually indentured servants. Soon the Dutch were bringing slaves into the port from Curacao and Angola. The philosophy was not to bring slaves directly from Africa, but instead to season them in the West Indies. This part of the triangular trade will be key in bringing in slaves and beginning the process of what became the mental enslavement of many of the people. Blacks who were kidnapped in Africa or traded to Europeans were chained together and held in large pens, sometimes contained in large castles or forts overlooking the mighty Atlantic Ocean. When a slave ship came, the slaves were often traded for goods. The ship's holds were filled with human cargo. Slaves were chained together, tightly, side by side, and transported to the Western Hemisphere in ships that tossed and turned in the ocean. Slaves were often from different villages, spoke different languages, and had little in common with their peers. It wasn't as if these folks all spoke the same common African language and had many commonalities besides being slaves. They were different as the nations of Europe, with varying cultural norms and mores, including language and oftentimes religion. Slaves who were rebellious were often tossed overboard and fed to the sharks who followed into the wake of the ships. The women on the ships were abused and taken by members of the crew, oftentimes for sexual favors, a key element in what became the mental enslavement of not only the men, but the women. Many of the mighty warriors and proud men had to stand by helpless, as women were taken advantage of, rendering them helpless. And this was really only a prelude to what would become. And you see, most of the slaves were brought from what was called the Gold Coast of Africa, and the journey would begin up here in England, in towns like Liverpool and London. They would sail down, make some stops here on the Iberian coast, Canary Islands, come down, pick up the slaves here, and then they would either go directly to the islands set up by Columbus, which is Hispaniola, present-day Dominican Republic, and Haiti, and then the other slave islands of Cuba, Jamaica, and then Puerto Rico. Sometimes they did the direct route from the west coast of Africa right to South America, because obviously it's a shorter distance. But this triangle is what we refer to as a triangular trade. Like I said, the ships would come down here, pick up their cargo, drop them off here for goods. The slaves would be seasoned, and then some of the slaves would be picked up, brought into this area of South Carolina, in Charleston, and then further up into the colonies in the Northeast. And then after those cargoes were unloaded, they would pick up raw materials and goods, bring them back over into Europe, unload the ships, and do it all over again. Once in the West Indies, all the hopes of escape were almost dashed, and the slave became trained, often brutally, to work as an intensive labor and farming, tobacco, sugarcane, both crops that financed the backbone of what became Western civilization. Slaves who were deemed rebellious were whipped and beaten until their spirit broke. If they did not break and refused to work, they were either sold to another master, or if no return was possible on an investment, they were killed so as not to give the other slaves hope of breaking down the power structure. This is a cross-section. This is a pretty famous rendition of what a slave ship would have looked like. This is a cross-section of the different decks of the ships, and these people in here are tightly packed, right next to each other, sometimes on top of each other, and you can see the different levels of the ship. So this is how they would transport people from Africa over to what became the New World in the Western Hemisphere. The broken slaves were then brought to the mainland, and the Bronx first slaves were actually brought by a man named Lewis Morris around 1670 from Barbados. It is known that the slaves and indentured servants of Morris, when they got here, actually mutinied and were stopped by a man named Thomas Gibbs. This was the first slave insurrection in the Bronx. Lewis Morris died in 1672, and his uncle, also named Lewis, took control of the land. You're going to see a copy of his will later on. The English had taken possession of the colony of New Netherlands in 1664 and renamed it New York after the Duke of York. After the English took control, both Anglo and black populations began to rise. As slaves became more important to the local economy, the need for their service along with indentured servants was obvious. Here, slaves worked on small grain farms, chopped down trees, and worked as tradesmen. Since this area did not grow the cash crops of the Caribbean in the South, slaves were often useful around the home and in shops. Slaves occupied jobs as coopers, barrel makers, blacksmiths, horsemen, and handymen. There were a few large plantations, notably the Phillips Plantation, which existed from present-day Riverdale up into Westchester County. Its proprietor, Frederick Phillips, was involved in many endeavors, including running illegal slave routes from Madagascar through the West Indies to numerous cities in the colonies. Just as an aside, if you do some research on Frederick Phillips and some of his exploits, it tends to be a very interesting read. He was involved in privateering and numerous endeavors that were quite illegal, and it's noted in some of the records how court cases were brought against him, but it's an interesting commentary. Slavery was different here in the North than in the South, but we do have numerous accounts of slaves running away from slavery. I'll read some of those excerpts for you in 1 minute. While we're here, after the English come and take over, you can see how the population grew, and I know this might be tough to read, but here I've put, this is the white population of Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, and South Carolina. Now, you see that the population is growing, and here in Massachusetts, the white population far outgains the black population. But as you move further south, you can see, for instance, in Virginia, you have almost half as many blacks as you do whites, and in South Carolina, you have about 4,000 more blacks than you did whites in the colony. Here in Westchester County, you can see how the white male population here compares to the black male population down here, and the same relationship here with females on both sides, just to give you a sense of how many slaves were actually here. The reason why we know the number of slaves was because in 1755 a census was taken of the slaves in Westchester. This is actually a copy of the slave census, and here you can see slaves' names. I know it's going to be tough with the lighting, but you have the name of the slave and oftentimes their age right next to it. So at the top, you really can't see, there's a guy named Joseph. He was 50 years old, and it goes down listing the slaves' ages and their names. And this is the other side of the of the census. And again, you can see the names. Sometimes you'll see who owned them, and it should have what their ages were because they want to keep accurate count of who was here. We also know about the number of slaves through the wills and through the record. Wills would often tell us not only how many pieces of property someone owned, but also how many slaves they had and who they were going to give their land and property to at their death. This was interesting because this is the last will of Lewis Morris, and here we see that he gives William Penn, proprietor of Pennsylvania, state I'm from, one of his Negro men, should Penn come dwell in America, which I thought was interesting. And I found out during research that Lewis Morris, after he came from England, he was part of the Cromwellian Revolution. After he came over, he actually picked up the Quaker religion in the West Indies, and that's how he would have had this relationship with William Penn. I thought that was interesting. And again, to see slaves as runaways, this is an excerpt. Most of these excerpts come from a colonial survey that was done by Professor Lloyd Eltan, the borough historian, and he collected a number of documents over 20 or 30 years pertaining to blacks in the Bronx for an upcoming publication. So that's where I'm getting these pieces of information from. This is a runaway ad that describes a slave as a lusty young fellow about 20 years of age, and it describes what he's wearing, and this is one of the slaves that ran away. The American Revolution was an interesting time for blacks. As you saw in the graphs, there was a sizable percentage of blacks in the colonies, yet there was a decision that had to be made about their participation in the war. Blacks had taken arms in the 7 Years' War and fought as well as their white counterparts in many cases. In 1770, a black man named Crispus Attucks was the first man killed in what became known as the Boston Massacre. Blacks fought alongside Minutemen at Lexington and Concord, and notably at Bunker Hill. Yet, in 1775, George Washington ordered that no black, slave or free, be allowed to take arms in the colonial militia. Subsequently, Lord Dunmore, who was the disposed royal governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation that would free any black who took up arms for the crown. There were even instances where black redcoats fought against their masters. One such situation where a slave actually captured his master and brought him to the British. Eventually, Washington allowed blacks to fight, and over 5,000 black soldiers fought for the American freedom. There were a few black soldiers who actually fought here in the Bronx, and Professor Eltan has an article in, I think, the Riverdale Press that came out yesterday that highlights their story. And also, there was a fort not too far from here called Negro Fort that was garrisoned by black troops who fought for the British. That's currently on St. George Crescent between 206th Street and the Grand Concourse, about 10 minutes away from where we're standing right now. After the Revolution, New York began its slow process of gradual emancipation. Groups like the New York Manumission Society were formed, that one led by Chief Justice, our first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Jay, eventually taken over by Alexander Hamilton. Slavery was formally abolished in New York State in 1827. This comes from a newspaper produced in the Bronx called the Westchester Patriot in 1813, and this is a listing for what a slave runaway would have looked like. What was interesting about this comes from a large newspaper. In this newspaper, there are ads for numerous things, also a listing for a runaway indentured servant, and this was listed as if it was just a classified. It talks about a black boy named Sam between the ages of 19 and 20, describes what he was wearing, and it talks about his conditions for running away. All persons are forbid harboring or concealing said boy under the severest penalty of the law. John P. Delancey from West Farms, May 26, 1813. So 14 years later, slavery is abolished. After slavery, we see the population of blacks grow slightly while the overall percentage of blacks in the Bronx drops. There are a number of reasons for this. First, former slaves were able to establish businesses, own property, and lived in small, self-contained communities. This will explain why families grew. Second, there wasn't a massive migration of blacks coming into the country or out of the South to the open lands of the Bronx. Remember, at this time, the Bronx is really open space. Conversely, Europeans were able to leave their countries of origin to seek out the American dream, as has been dramatized and talked about and analyzed in so many American novels, movies, and scholarly texts. These immigrants, though, also faced nativism, jingoism, and xenophobia, but were slowly able to mesh themselves into the fabric of American society. The towns of the Bronx grew and became German, Irish, and Italian, with small settlements of blacks interdispersed throughout the landscape. Wealthy New Yorkers began to buy real estate in the East Bronx and build opulent mansions and summer homes. Blacks worked in their stables, drove their carriages, and worked in homes as butlers and servants. Blacks would often compete with new immigrants for these jobs, creating a resentment that would tip during the New York City draft riots. I chose this photo of Highbridge to show the rapid development of the Bronx. Not only did you have public works projects, this is part of the Croton Aqueduct system, but you also had a number of ironworks and factories that began to appear here in the Bronx. This is a drawing of the James and Beebe Ironworks. I think the most powerful part of this drawing is not just that you see an ironwork and you see body of water, but you see the landscape of the Bronx and how it looked. And you can compare that to how we see the Bronx today, even though 24% of our land is park space. Believe it or not, Abraham Lincoln lost the Democratic candidates in 1860 and 1864. He first lost to John C. Breckinridge and then to disposed General of the Army of the Potomac, George B. McClellan. And just a note, actually Dr. Peter Derrick told me this, McClellan Avenue is actually not named after George B. McClellan, it's named after his son who was the mayor of New York City. So that's good to know. The fact that Lincoln lost the popular vote should not surprise us, though, because New York was a mercantile city and heavily benefited from cotton and other cash crops that were sent to Europe or utilized here. Just to give a plug to another historical society, the New York Historical Society, I don't know if some of you have seen their new exhibition on slavery in New York, does a good job bringing the economic component of slavery and New York's connection to light. And I got this information from the New York Historical Society. They said that 38 cents out of every dollar made from Southern cotton directly benefited New Yorkers. So for every dollar that the cotton industry brought in, almost half of that was coming into New Yorkers. Also, New York was a democratic city, and the Democrats were the party of states' rights, popular sovereignty, and ultimately slavery. The Republicans were not all abolitionists, but they wanted to see the Union preserved, and they followed the lead of the Republican president, Abraham Lincoln. The draft riots occurred in New York City in July of 1863. On the heels of the great victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, the city became the scene of the worst riots in American history. Copperhead Democrat Fernando Wood, who was the mayor at the time, was a politician who wanted the war to end and was extremely anti-black, and he stirred up the immigrant classes of the city through newspaper editorials that ultimately spread a lot of fear. He played up the fears of immigrants losing their jobs, saying that free blacks would take their jobs, and that if you fought for the Union, you would be fighting for the people who would replace them. To compound this, Lincoln's draft also included a bounty where rich people could pay to have their spots taken for them. This caused many people to have negative feelings and oppose the draft. And eventually, the feelings were stirred up enough that a mob formed and that looted, murdered, and created havoc throughout the city. 105 people died as a result of the draft riots. And the riots actually had to be stopped by soldiers who were coming fresh from the Gettysburg battlefield. Here in the Bronx, we have accounts of the mob destroying railroad tracks, attacking the draft offices at Morrisania and West Farms, and even having to be stopped by local citizens by the time they had reached Westchester Square. And this is a picture of the Morrisania Drum and Fife Corps. After the war, blacks continued to live and work here. The establishment of numerous racetracks allowed blacks to work as jockeys and stable hands. In William Rhoden's book, $40 Million Slaves, he talks about the struggles of numerous black jockeys, even here in the Bronx. Leonard Jerome's racetrack, which existed from the late 1860s to the early 1890s, employed blacks and was extremely successful and profitable as a racetrack. On other fields, blacks were establishing churches like the Centerville African Methodist Episcopal Church on Union Court Road, which our friend Tom Casey here did extensive research on. That church existed at a time in 1855, and it was incorporated in 1855, when we were still in Southern slavery, and also the Bronx, again, was largely unpopulated. Tom went up to the Westchester archives and was able to produce the original incorporation. He has the names of the people who incorporated the church, and we know that the church existed well up until the 1890s. There wasn't just a church there was also a cemetery, I believe. Now, if you go to that site today, there are a number of food markets and shops, but hopefully, we can commemorate that site someday. Also, there were a number of entrepreneurs, like our friend Cedar Jack here. Cedar Jack Lyons established a business along the site, which was currently right by Yankee Stadium, and he harvested clams from the Harlem River. He's only an example of the number of the entrepreneurs that established businesses among the numerous waterways of the Bronx, taking advantage of the vibrant seafood and seafaring communities along the shore. Even the great Booker T. Washington actually visited the Bronx at the home of the railroad magnate and financier Collis P. Huntington, and gave speeches in the city. At the Huntington Free Library located in Westchester Square, if you make an appointment and go inside, they have a visitor's book. If you open that visitor's book, it's the original visitor's book from when the library first opened. You can go through the pages of that book and you can actually see where Booker T. Washington signed his name in the book. And that's in Westchester Square. It's right next to the Apple Savings Bank, and there's like a few restaurants on the other side. Are there any questions? Yes?
Yeah, I want to know if I'm African descent. Listen, let me explain. I was born in Brooklyn. My parents is from Arkansas and North Carolina. Am I African descent?
I would guess yes. The key is to, trace where your family came from. So you say your parents come from Africa, Arkansas and North Carolina.
Yeah.
Well, they had to come in at some time. So the key would be to find,
Hold on, what do you mean by African descent? That's what it means.
as if your ancestors came from Africa.
So if I'm born in Brooklyn, I'm not African descent.
No, your ancestors are from Africa.
I wanted to answer him. If anybody that wants to really trace and find out where their families come from, what they can do. Louis Gates had a series on. He's the chairman of the African Studies in Princeton University, I believe. And he did a study on African Americans and their roots. He actually did Oprah Winfrey and a couple of these people. And you can trace it by a genealogist. You can do that for you. The fees range from 150 to like 1,000, but it can be traced, and they can do DNA samples to find out exactly where do you come from in Africa. So that can be done.
Thank you.
So you take any more questions?
Yeah, I'll take one more.
Yeah, okay, I was sort of like thinking about what the gentleman in front was trying to say about African descent. You said you were gonna refer to blacks as people with African descent, right? And I wanna know what group of peoples are you talking about? Can you give a list of the people that you're referring to? Or are you thinking about people are descendants of slaves?
Well,
Africans.
yeah, I mean, the problem is that a lot of blacks can't trace their lineage directly back to their country of origin. So the reason why I simplified that and laid that caveat out is because people identify themselves multiple ways today. So I wanted to simplify and say basically black would be a person who is of African descent who comes from people who were slaves at one point. Maybe I should clarify that.
Not just that you have some African blood in you, or some of your ancestors happen to be African. That's not what you're talking about.
I mean, a lot of these lines are extremely crossed up. Like we could argue that all of us are African because of the evolutionary lines go back to the first, human being of African, African descent on the continent. The reason why I said that is because people might identify themselves as Caribbean American. People might identify themselves